station. Any unattended articles are likely to be removed without warning.
This is the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman. The Hour of History Cities podcast, as well as other Hour of History podcasts, can be streamed and downloaded at hourofhistory.com, iTunes, Google Music, our YouTube channel, and TuneIn. Be sure to also check out our Hour of History blog at hourofhistory.com/blog. And now we begin the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman.
Hello, and welcome to Hour of History Cities podcast special World Cup edition. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and today is the last episode of the World Cup edition of the Cities podcast. So thank you for joining us on Hour of History, where it's our world, any place, anytime. So now we're looking at the last city that hosts this Russia World Cup. It's going to be an interesting city, and then we'll close this series with a few questions to consider when you're looking into the sort of general themes that we see in cities that tend to host these sort of events. The last city is very interesting. I saved it because I wanted it to have its sort of own light to shine, because I think it's going to be a fantastic place to host this 2018 Russia World Cup. It's called Nizhny Novgorod. Nizhny Novgorod is a massive city, fifth largest in Russia, 1.25 million people. It's on the Volga River. It's absolutely beautiful. Surrounding areas are beautiful. It's a bit of a distance from Moscow, so people are going to have to travel quite a bit to get there. It's like 500 kilometers. So there is a distance to get to Nizhny Novgorod, but I think it'll be well worth it if you're going to go. Now, Nizhny Novgorod, a lot of people just call it Nizhny. Those two words deserve some explanation. Nizhny means lower, and Novgorod means town, or new town. New Gorod town. So it was originally just called Novgorod, but as you might imagine, there's a lot of Novgorods in Russia. There's a lot of new towns, just like there's a lot of new towns in the United States. So it's kind of funny when we're presented with these sort of, these Russian names, and Nizhny Novgorod. It sounds great, and it sounds beautiful, and it sounds Russian to those American ears, yet it's just called Lower Newtown, and people just refer to it as Lower. Like most cities that we've covered that play host to these sort of events, it has a long history. It goes back to the 13th century. It was sort of a frontier town for the Slavic peoples, pushing out along the Volga River out and coming up against these Turkic tribes and sort of these continued pushes from Central Asia into Russia. So there's a beautiful Kremlin, a beautiful castle on the river that protects Nizhny Novgorod from any invaders. It remained in Slavic hands for most of its history, and it was an important city even through the Russian Empire up into the Soviet Union and currently where we are today. It was a trade center for the Russian Empire because it has that nice eastern location. It's on a river. It's able to produce a lot and move things out. When the Soviet Union comes to power, like with most cities that we talked about, Nizhny Novgorod gets a makeover, a new name. It's named after the writer Maxim Gorky, who wrote about the sort of squalor of the proletariat living in cities. So it becomes called Gorky from 1932 to 1990. And during that time period, it becomes a production center for the Soviet Union for automobiles and things like that, the Detroit of Russia, if you will. But it also, as a result of that, becomes one of the Soviet Union's infamous closed cities. So foreigners aren't allowed to go to Nizhny Novgorod between 1932 and 1990. In 1990, it gets renamed. It goes back to Nizhny Novgorod, and it is a becomes a modern city, it opens up and becomes, quite successful because people want to move where jobs are, and it has infrastructure. It has sort of the potential for this growth because of its location, and it attracts a lot of people. It also has a pretty nice climate. It'll be pleasant temperatures during the World Cup, imagine mid 70s, maybe high 70s in the later days, but and that's Fahrenheit, 22, 24 degrees Celsius. So it's going to be pleasant. It gets snowy, as you might imagine Russia to do in the winter, but generally speaking, this is a very nice city. Looking at the stadium that was built, a new football stadium was built for this World Cup. It's like the others, going to hold 45,000 people, so it gets those FIFA rankings, so it can host a World Cup event. They have to be approved by the federations in order for them to host World Cup games, and they have to have at least 44,000 seats. So they're going to have all the bells and whistles of a new stadium. They broke ground in 2015 and it was completed in 2018. It's an absolutely beautiful stadium that looks out over the Volga River, and right in its shadow is Alexander Nevsky Cathedral from the late 19th century. So there's a beautiful sort of tie to this Russian Imperial Orthodox history that's right next to the stadium. So it'll be sort of a fantastic event for the teams that get to go. It's going to play host to group matches, round of 16, and quarterfinal events. The teams that will play there starting June 18th are Sweden and South Korea, Argentina and Croatia, England and Panama, Switzerland, and Costa Rica. And so Nizhny Novgorod's going to play host to some very interesting, very important games, and it's absolutely going to attract anyone who's interested in following these teams to make the journey out there. Now, talking a little bit about themes that we've seen throughout this World Cup, and themes that we're able to deduce as looking at this as historians of cities, looking at this in terms of hour of history. What trends are sort of found? And one of them is this push, these new stadiums that are built. So stadiums being rebuilt or modified significantly so they can be good enough for the World Cup and hold 45,000 people. And that's not a challenge for cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, the first two that were covered in this series, in which they have soccer teams, they have huge fan bases, they are fairly wealthy cities in terms of the world status, they have multimillionaires, they have sort of funds that can draw into these sort of things, and they're going to use the stadiums. Moscow, St. Petersburg, this is not a problem. But you look at other places that we've covered, like Nizhny Novgorod, who have a new stadium now, a 45,000 seat stadium, and they didn't have a team to play in it. The team that used to play in Nizhny Novgorod disbanded because of financial issues. They, were basically out of the Russian Premier League in the late 2000s. And so as part of this stadium deal, a new football club was started, FC Olympiets Nizhny Novgorod, and they had to start at the bottom, third division in 2015, and they're slowly climbing their way up. They're now in the second division of the Russian league, but they're playing in this massive new stadium, and one has to wonder, how is this sort of stadium going to continue? Is it going to be filled up every week, week in and week out for a second division Russian club? Can there be continued investment in these sort of clubs that come to these new stadiums in Nizhny, in Samara, in Saransk, in Sochi? Are these places going to just turn into ghost towns or ghost arenas? Nizhny Novgorod, the fifth largest city in Russia, it's not going to disappear. There's certainly a market for the football game there, but it'll be interesting to see how these things work out. Sochi, the city that hosted the World Cup or the 2014 Olympics, has sort of an appeal for tourists to come, and now they have the infrastructure too. So that seems like a wise decision. Also looking at these cities that were chosen, it's very interesting to see some of these cities, a few of them I mentioned throughout the series were closed cities under the Soviet Union. There aren't many closed cities left in the world. What it means is that you need special permits to enter the city, you need special permits to leave the city. But some of these were closed cities for a significant portion of the 20th century. Now, I see this as Russia's sort of way of saying, okay, for a long time we didn't let people in these cities under the Soviet Union, but now we are going to need to encourage to get people to come to Russia. The tourist dollars are some of the most important sources of economic growth in nations that that are looking for new sources of economic growth. Russia certainly has an economy else in other ways, but Russia's sort of showcasing these historic cities that go back, to the 13th century and even earlier, that play a certain important part in this myth making of Russian history, in this building up of a great long Russian narrative that I think Russia is certainly in favor of, rather than what has been used in the past. So I think it'll be interesting to see how the world reacts to these cities. It'll be interesting to see the interactions between the visitors of the city and the city itself. One thing that the World Cup has always sort of struggled with, and certainly any international or Olympic events do, are the interactions between these massive influxes of fans to watch the game and the emotions that come with that. Certainly, it's great when fans win and they're happy and they pump money into the local economy, but they also tend to do things like leave a massive trash footprint. Sometimes they get unhappy and they lose and they start to destroy things. Other times they interact with the people. Think about this. Someone who grew up in Nizhny Novgorod might have grown up there when it was a closed city, and this is something that's new. It's going to be different having people come from all over the world. People come from South Korea, and people come from Costa Rica and Panama. Nizhny Novgorod is about to get just a massive influx not only of dollars, but of culture. Not to say that it didn't already have an enormous amount of culture. So, all in all, these Russian cities that are hosting the World Cup are massive population centers for the Russian Federation. As we talked about, they're all significant in terms of government and politics. Almost all of them are the seat of their oblast or republic or province. And so these are important cities. They're going to showcase what's going right in the Russian Federation, and I think they're really going to make a good impression on the world. Now, Russia is a massive country with a lot of cities, and one could debate why certain cities were given new stadiums, given new opportunities to present themselves in front of the world, and that's absolutely a conversation I'd like to have, and we probably will as we continue to follow the World Cup. So please check out our other Hour of History discussions about the World Cup 2018. Matthias and I sat down and discussed if we should even watch it. We considered the ramifications of sort of going to an event that glorifies Vladimir Putin. We also talked about other sort of reasons why people tend to talk about boycott and if that's even an effective means. I know for sure I'll be tuning in. I think I will know a little more about these cities and a little more about these stadiums, and I hope you do as well. So thank you for joining us on Hour of History Cities podcast. Thank you to James for producing these audio videos, and please remember to subscribe. Have a great day and enjoy Russia 2018. World Cup.
World
World Cup.
World
World Cup. World Cup. World Cup. World Cup. World